A single hair. That's all it took to catch a killer who'd been free for 34 years. But here's what will shock you. That hair was there the entire time, sitting in an evidence box. Documented. Photographed. Waiting. Toller. Documented. Waiting. Documented. 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 For 3 decades, Jennifer Whitehorse's family called detectives every year on the anniversary of her death, asking the same desperate question. Have you found anything new? The answer was always no. Until March 2024, when Detective Lisa Morgan opened a cardboard box that smelled of dust and forgotten promises. Inside was a burgundy wool jacket, and clinging to its collar, barely visible even under harsh fluorescent lights, was a strand of hair so fine, so delicate, that in 1990 it might as well have been invisible. But this wasn't 1990 anymore. The technology that could have saved this family 34 years of anguish finally existed. And what it would reveal would expose not just a killer, but a serial predator who'd been hiding in plain sight, protected by bureaucratic chaos and a system that failed Indigenous women over and over again. This is the story of how a 9-year-old college student vanished in a Wyoming blizzard, how 3 different law enforcement agencies let her killer slip away, and how her brother spent his entire adult life refusing to let his sister become another forgotten statistic. If you believe that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, you need to hear what happened next. The fluorescent lights in the evidence room hummed with the persistence of old secrets. Detective Lisa Morgan pulled on latex gloves, her fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to touch. Box 1991, 34 sat before her, its cardboard corners soft with age, bearing the faded signature of a man who'd retired a decade ago, frustrated and defeated. Inside lay a burgundy wool jacket. It still carried the ghost of December 1990, the scent of dust and time. Yes, but something else too. Something that felt almost like a presence. The jacket had belonged to Jennifer Whitehorse, a 19-year-old Northern Arapaho woman whose murder had gone unsolved for 34 years. And clinging to its collar, so fine it was almost invisible under normal light, was a single dark hair. Detective Morgan lifted the jacket carefully. This hair had been noted in the original investigator's report. Detective James Patterson had documented it with the frustration of a man who knew he was holding evidence that technology simply couldn't process. Not in 1990. But this was 2024, and the Wyoming State Crime Lab had just acquired STR-DNA analysis equipment capable of extracting profiles from samples that would have been useless decades ago. Morgan's phone buzzed against the metal evidence table. The text from the lab read, "Viable sample confirmed. Ready for analysis." After 34 years of silence, Jennifer Whitehorse might finally have her voice back. If you're the kind of person who believes that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, this is a story you'll want to follow to the end. And if these forgotten cases matter to you, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories, like Jennifer's, waiting to be told. December 15th, 1990. The Wind River Reservation disappeared beneath snow that fell in thick, silent curtains. The kind of snow that erases footprints within hours. The kind that makes people vanish. Jennifer Whitehorse pulled her burgundy wool jacket tight as she stepped out of her grandmother's small house on Ethite Road. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow that barely penetrated the swirling darkness. Her breath formed small clouds that disappeared into the night there one moment, gone the next, like Jennifer herself would soon be. Her grandmother, Margaret, watched from the kitchen window. Years later, she would tell investigators about the feeling she had that night, a heaviness in the air that made her want to call Jennifer back inside. But 19-year-old girls don't listen to grandmother's intuitions, especially when they're late for what they think is opportunity. Jennifer had told Margaret she was meeting someone at the Truck Stop Cafe on Federal Boulevard in Riverton, someone who might have information about a summer job in Casper. With graduation from community college approaching, Jennifer was desperate for work that would help her escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped so many of her friends. The 40-minute drive from the reservation to Riverton was one Jennifer had made countless times. That night, she made it for the last time. The Riverton truck stop sat at the intersection of two highways, a beacon of neon and diesel fumes that never slept. Waitress Carol Jenkins was working the late shift, serving coffee to long-haul truckers and the occasional local brave enough to venture out in the storm. She remembered Jennifer clearly. The young woman seemed nervous, constantly checking the door, barely touching the coffee she'd ordered. She sat in booth 7, the one facing the parking lot, for nearly 2 hours. Around 11:30, Carol noticed Jennifer suddenly straighten up, as if she'd recognized someone. The young woman left $1 on the table and walked out into the blizzard without saying a word. Through the frost-covered windows, Carol caught a glimpse of Jennifer approaching a dark vehicle parked near the edge of the lot. But the snow was too heavy. She couldn't make out details of the car. Couldn't see who was inside. That was the last time anyone saw Jennifer Whitehorse alive. When she failed to return home by morning, Margaret called the tribal police. Officer James Murphy drove out to check the roads, assuming Jennifer had slid into a ditch somewhere along the treacherous route home. The blizzard had dumped 8 inches of snow overnight, making travel nearly impossible, and erasing any tracks that might have told a story. For 3 days, search teams combed every highway and back road between Riverton and Ethetti. Volunteers from the reservation joined county deputies and off-duty state troopers in a grid search that expanded wider each day, hope thinning with each empty mile. They found Jennifer's truck first. Abandoned in a ravine 12 miles south of the truck stop. Keys missing. Interior covered with a thin layer of snow that had blown through the broken passenger window. Jennifer herself was discovered on the 3rd day by a rancher checking his cattle. She lay beneath a stand of cottonwood trees near Crowheart Butte, her body partially covered by snow and debris. The scene made no sense to the first responders. Jennifer was fully clothed. Her burgundy jacket zipped against the cold. She was lying on her back, in an almost peaceful position, as if she had simply laid down to rest and never woken up. But Jennifer Whitehorse had been murdered, and her killer had just made the first of many escapes that would define this case for the next 3 decades. The escape through bureaucratic chaos. Within hours of finding Jennifer's body, 3 separate law enforcement agencies arrived at Crowheart Butte, each claiming jurisdiction, each following different protocols, each working, essentially, against the others. Tribal Police Officer James Murphy had been first to respond, but the location technically fell under Fremont County Sheriff's jurisdiction. When FBI agents arrived, claiming federal authority due to Jennifer's status as a Native American woman potentially killed on tribal land, the crime scene had already been compromised by well-meaning but uncoordinated efforts. Detective James Patterson from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office found himself caught in a nightmare. The FBI agents, fresh from Quantico and unfamiliar with reservation politics, treated local officers like obstacles. Meanwhile, tribal police felt pushed aside by federal investigators who showed little understanding of cultural sensitivities or the deep mistrust many Native families harbored toward outside law enforcement. The evidence collection suffered immediately. Jennifer's body was photographed and documented by 3 different agencies. The burgundy jacket was logged into the county's evidence system, but samples were sent to 3 different labs, causing delays and confusion. That single hair on the collar, noted by the county's crime scene technician, but somehow never making it to the FBI's initial evidence list. Patterson spent the first week trying to coordinate between agencies, more interested in protecting their turf than catching Jennifer's killer. Phone calls went unreturned. Witness interview schedules conflicted. Crucial forensic evidence sat in bureaucratic limbo. The truck stop where Jennifer was last seen became another point of contention. It sat just outside Tribal Boundaries county jurisdiction, but the FBI insisted on interviewing witnesses themselves. Carol Jenkins, the waitress, ended up being questioned 4 separate times by different investigators. By her 4th interview, her memory had become muddied by repetition, and she began second-guessing details she'd been certain about initially. The most damaging confusion involved the dark vehicle Carol had glimpsed. The FBI's report described it as a sedan. The county's statement called it a pickup. Tribal police heard rumors about a van with out-of-state plates, but this information never made it into any official report. 3 weeks into the investigation, the agencies finally held a coordination meeting. By then, the trail of the mysterious vehicle had gone completely cold. Patterson's personal notes from that period, discovered years later in his desk after retirement, revealed his growing desperation. One entry, dated January 3, 1991, simply read, "This girl deserves better than what we're giving her." The failures in Jennifer's case weren't unique. They represented systemic problems that persist today. If this story is opening your eyes to how justice can be derailed by bureaucracy, please rate and share this episode. Awareness is the first step toward change. Daniel Whitehorse was 17 when his sister died, a junior in high school who had looked up to Jennifer as both sibling and surrogate parent after their mother's death from diabetes complications 3 years earlier. The night Jennifer didn't come home, Daniel waited in the kitchen with his grandmother, watching the clock tick past midnight, fighting the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. When Officer Murphy arrived at dawn with news that they'd found Jennifer's truck, Daniel felt his childhood end in that moment, replaced by a responsibility he'd never asked for and would carry for the next 34 years. The funeral arrangements became the first of many battles Daniel would fight on his sister's behalf. The FBI requested that Jennifer's burial be delayed pending further forensic examination, but Margaret insisted on traditional Arapaho customs that required prompt burial to help Jennifer's spirit find peace. The compromise felt like disrespect. The family felt pressured throughout. Daniel watched his grandmother age years in those few days, her grief compounded by the feeling that even in death, outsiders were controlling decisions about her granddaughter. As the investigation stalled through 1991, Daniel appointed himself the family's liaison with law enforcement. He called Detective Patterson weekly for updates that became increasingly disappointing. Patterson, to his credit, always took the calls. But Daniel could hear the frustration in the detective's voice as leads dried up and bureaucratic obstacles multiplied. Daniel began keeping his own files, copying every police report the family was allowed to see, maintaining a timeline that grew more detailed than some official records. He'd planned to move to Denver after graduation, to study automotive repair. Instead, he stayed on the reservation to be near his grandmother, to maintain pressure on investigators, to seek justice for Jennifer. His bedroom became an informal command center, the walls covered with maps marking locations from witness statements, timelines of Jennifer's final day, photographs of evidence obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. His girlfriends never lasted long. Few could compete with a ghost for Daniel's attention. Margaret worried about her grandson's consuming grief, but she also understood it. In traditional Arapaho belief, unresolved deaths trapped spirits between worlds, unable to find peace until justice was achieved. Daniel wasn't just seeking answers for himself, he was trying to free his sister's spirit. The silence that settled over the Wind River Reservation after Jennifer's death wasn't the natural quiet of winter nights. It was calculated, born from generations of mistrust, reinforced by whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when outsiders approached. Rachel Spotted Eagle, Jennifer's closest friend since childhood, knew more about Jennifer's final weeks than she'd told any investigator. Jennifer had confided about receiving strange phone calls, someone asking questions about her schedule, claiming to offer job opportunities in Casper. The calls came at odd hours. Jennifer had mentioned feeling watched when she walked alone after dark. But when FBI agents interviewed Rachel, she offered only basic information about Jennifer's character and habits, never mentioning the phone calls, never mentioning Jennifer's growing unease. Rachel's reasons were complex, rooted in reservation history. Her grandfather had been taken to a boarding school as a child, where speaking Arapaho resulted in beatings. Her father had watched federal agents arrest tribal members on questionable charges throughout the 1970s. When the FBI agents questioned her about Jennifer, they mispronounced her name, showed no understanding of tribal customs, treated traditional beliefs as folklore rather than genuine spiritual practice. Other community members harbored their own fragments of crucial information. A gas station attendant had noticed a man with Colorado plates asking directions to the truck stop 2 days before Jennifer disappeared. The man's aggressive demeanor when questioned had felt predatory, but the attendant never reported it. An elder had experienced a vision about Jennifer's death, a warning about someone from outside the community, but knew that sharing spiritual insights with federal investigators would result in mockery. Teenage witnesses who'd seen Jennifer in her final weeks were terrified of becoming involved with law enforcement. One girl had overheard Jennifer on a payphone talking about meeting someone with connections to oil industry jobs. Jennifer had seemed excited, but nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly. The girl's parents explicitly forbade her from volunteering information. The cultural gap between investigators and the community became a chasm. Federal agents approached relationships through a law enforcement lens, treating friends as suspects, missing crucial connections because they didn't match conventional definitions. The investigation's heavy-handed approach created an adversarial atmosphere that reinforced the community's instinct to close ranks. By summer 1991, Detective Patterson's case files had grown thick with dead-end leads, contradictory witness statements, and forensic results that raised more questions than answers. The hair from Jennifer's jacket had been tested using the limited DNA technology available at the time. The results were inconclusive, basic genetic markers that weren't detailed enough for database comparison. Patterson requested additional testing, but budget constraints meant Jennifer's evidence sat in laboratory queues for months. His pursuit of the mysterious vehicle became an exercise in futility. The conflicting descriptions made it impossible to narrow down anything. By June, Carol Jenkins was no longer certain about any details beyond Jennifer approaching some kind of vehicle. Patterson's attempts to trace Jennifer's phone calls proved equally frustrating. In 1990, detailed phone records required court orders that took weeks to obtain. By the time he received permission, the trail was cold. The records showed several calls from payphones in various locations, but without caller ID, identifying the source proved impossible. Patterson's relationship with federal investigators deteriorated. The FBI's enthusiasm waned when early leads failed. Their attention shifted to more solvable cases. Local agents were reassigned. Patterson found himself increasingly isolated, working Jennifer's case with minimal support. His personal investment began taking a toll. His wife complained that he talked about Jennifer constantly. His partner requested a different assignment. His supervisor suggested focusing on newer cases with better prospects. But Patterson couldn't abandon Jennifer. By 1992, he'd exhausted every conventional investigative avenue, interviewed over 60 potential witnesses, followed dozens of tips that led nowhere. His evidence board covered an entire wall, red string, mapping relationships and timelines that never quite formed a coherent picture. In early 1993, Patterson convinced his department to fund a psychological profile from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The profile suggested Jennifer's killer was likely a white male between 25 and 45, someone familiar with the area but without local connections. It provided no actionable leads, just confirmation of what Patterson already suspected. The case went cold. Patterson retired in 2003. Moving to Florida with Jennifer's file haunting him. The box went into storage. The family's calls continued, year after year, on the anniversary of Jennifer's death. 34 years passed. March 2024. Detective Lisa Morgan stood in the Wyoming State Crime Lab, watching forensic analyst Dr. Sarah Chen extract DNA from that single hair. The advanced STR analysis equipment represented technological evolution that had transformed criminal investigations since 1990. What had been impossible was now routine. The hair measured barely 3 inches, dark brown with a slight wave. Under high magnification, Dr. Chen could see the root was intact, containing the cellular material necessary for DNA extraction. The process took 6 hours. Morgan paced the corridors, checking her phone obsessively. She'd called Daniel Whitehorse the previous day to inform him about the new testing. His voice had carried hope tempered by decades of disappointment. Daniel was now 51, his grandmother Margaret having passed 5 years earlier without ever learning who killed her granddaughter. As Dr. Chen prepared the sample for analysis, she discovered something unexpected. The hair contained not just nuclear DNA from the root, but also mitochondrial DNA preserved in the shaft. This dual genetic signature would provide 2 independent sources of identification. The breakthrough came at 4:17 inches the afternoon. Dr. Chen's computer chimed softly. The CODIS search had completed. 1 potential familial match identified. The DNA didn't match any convicted offender in the database, but it showed significant genetic similarities to someone whose DNA was on file similarities, suggesting a close biological relationship, possibly a sibling, parent, or child. The familial match belonged to Kevin Morrison, a 43-year-old construction worker from Denver who'd been arrested for domestic violence in 2018. Morgan spent the following morning researching Morrison's family history. Kevin had been born in Colorado, raised in Utah after his parents' divorce. His father, Richard Morrison, had worked in the oil industry throughout the 1980s and 92nd, a career requiring frequent relocation. The real breakthrough came from employment records. Richard Morrison had worked for Texaco as an equipment operator from 1987 to 1994. Company records showed he'd been stationed at drilling sites throughout Wyoming during 1990, including several locations within 100 miles of Wind River Reservation. His work schedule had included regular trips through Riverton. Morgan's excitement was tempered by a devastating discovery. Richard Morrison had died in a construction accident in 2003, 11 years earlier. The potential perpetrator had taken his secrets to the grave, apparently without ever being questioned about Jennifer Whitehorse's murder. Sometimes the answers we seek don't come with the satisfaction we imagine, but answers matter, even incomplete ones. If you're finding value in this investigation, please take a moment to rate this episode. It helps others discover these important stories. Further investigation into Richard Morrison's background revealed disturbing patterns. He'd been arrested twice for soliciting prostitutes. Employment records showed unexplained gaps coinciding with sexual assault investigations in Colorado and Utah, though he'd never been charged. The picture that emerged was of a man who used his transient lifestyle to avoid scrutiny while targeting women he perceived as powerless. The connection to Jennifer became undeniable. Texaco records indicated Morrison had been working at a drilling site near Riverton throughout December 1990, housed in temporary worker housing within miles of the truck stop where Jennifer was last seen. His work schedule included evening shifts that would have ended around the time Jennifer arrived for her meeting. The timeline fit perfectly. Morgan contacted retired Detective Patterson, now 72 and living in Florida. His voice cracked with emotion as he listened to the DNA evidence explanation. Patterson admitted Morrison's name had never appeared in any original investigation files, a reminder of how easily the real perpetrator had slipped through the cracks. The most heartbreaking aspect? Investigators had come close during the original investigation. Patterson's files contained a report about questioning oil field workers in the Riverton area. But Morrison's name appeared only on a list of employees who'd been out of town during the initial canvass, a clerical error in the work schedule that eliminated him from consideration before he could be interviewed. Morgan found Kevin Morrison at a construction site in Aurora, Colorado. When she approached showing her badge, Morrison's expression shifted from casual interest to guarded weariness. They sat in Morrison's pickup truck, windows fogging with their breath, as Morgan explained the DNA evidence linking his family to Jennifer's murder. When she mentioned his father's name, Morrison's composure cracked. 34 years of buried suspicion surfaced in his eyes. Kevin had been 22 when his father died. Their relationship had been complicated by Richard Morrison's drinking and frequent absences. Kevin admitted he'd always harbored dark suspicions about his father's behavior around women, inappropriate comments, disturbing jokes. The most damaging revelation. Kevin described his father's reaction to news coverage of Jennifer's murder in early 1991. Richard had followed the case obsessively, clipping newspaper articles, watching every television report. When federal agents canvassed oil field workers, Richard had seemed genuinely relieved when his name was crossed off without an interview. Kevin remembered his father burning papers in their backyard around that time. The intensity of the fire, his father's secretive behavior, it had struck Kevin as unusual. While cleaning out Richard's apartment after the construction accident, Kevin found a collection of newspaper clippings about unsolved murders involving young women across several western states. The clippings dated back to the mid-1980s, continuing through the 1990s. Kevin had destroyed the collection, disturbed by what it might imply. But the memory had haunted him for decades. The conversation grew increasingly confessional. Kevin described his father's paranoid behavior in the months before his death, constantly checking rearview mirrors, avoiding certain routes, speaking frequently about cold cases being reopened with new technology. Most chilling. After the construction accident, hidden beneath the spare tire in Richard's truck, Kevin found a small wooden box containing jewelry and personal items that clearly belonged to different women. He'd turned it over to police as part of the estate, but the items were never connected to any investigation. Trophies from other victims. Evidence of a pattern extending far beyond Jennifer's murder. As their conversation concluded, Kevin Morrison broke down completely. He'd suspected his father's involvement in serious crimes for decades, but had been too afraid to come forward. The guilt had eaten away at him for years. The news reached Wind River Reservation on a cold March morning, eerily similar to the December day when Jennifer disappeared. Daniel Whitehorse received Detective Morgan's call while sitting in his grandmother's kitchen, the same room where he'd waited for Jennifer that final night. Exactly 34 years and 3 months after his sister's death, The tribal council convened an emergency meeting. Elder Dorothy Burns, now in her 80s, spoke about the spiritual significance of finally naming Jennifer's killer. In traditional Arapaho belief, the unresolved murder had kept Jennifer's spirit trapped between worlds. The DNA evidence represented spiritual liberation, allowing Jennifer to complete her journey to the afterlife. Daniel's reaction was complex. Relief at finally having answers was overshadowed by frustration that Richard Morrison had died without facing justice. There would be no trial, no opportunity for the community to hear the full truth, no chance for Morrison to account for other potential victims. The closure felt incomplete. Detective Morgan's investigation expanded to examine Morrison's potential involvement in other unsolved murders. The jewelry found in his truck was being compared to evidence from cold cases dating back to the 1980s. Early results suggested Jennifer might have been one of many victims. The realization that Morrison had operated as a serial killer for possibly decades added another layer of tragedy. Earlier identification might have saved other lives. Federal authorities announced a comprehensive review of cold cases involving Native American women in areas where Morrison had worked. The investigation revealed at least 6 other murders, sharing similarities with Jennifer's case, all involving young Native women who disappeared after being approached by strangers offering employment opportunities. Morrison had specifically targeted Indigenous women, knowing crimes against them typically received less attention. Jennifer's remains were ceremonially reburied, according to traditional Arapaho customs. The ceremony took place at sunrise on a hill overlooking the reservation, the entire community gathering to honor Jennifer's memory and acknowledge the long struggle for justice. Elder Burns offered prayers in Arapaho, asking the spirits to welcome Jennifer home and to guide other families still seeking answers about missing loved ones. For Daniel Whitehorse, now 51, and grandfather to children who would grow up knowing their great-aunt's story, the end of the investigation marked the beginning of a different mission. He established a foundation focused on supporting families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, using Jennifer's case as an example of how persistence and advancing technology could eventually deliver answers. The Foundation's work ensures Jennifer's story continues to serve a purpose beyond her individual case, helping other families navigate the complex process of seeking justice. Sarah's case sparked broader conversations about jurisdictional issues that complicate investigations of crimes on tribal lands. Reform advocates used Morrison's identification to highlight the need for better coordination between federal, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies. As Daniel stood at Jennifer's grave following the reburial ceremony, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had witnessed his sister's final hours, he felt a peace that had eluded him for 34 years. The questions that had consumed his adult life had finally been answered. Jennifer's spirit could rest. But the work of protecting other women, of ensuring no family would endure decades of uncertainty, would continue. In that ongoing mission, Jennifer's memory lives on, transformed from a symbol of unresolved trauma into a beacon of hope for justice delayed but never denied. Jennifer Whitehorse's case reminds us that some voices refuse to be silenced, even by death, even by decades of bureaucratic failure. If her story has moved you, if you believe these forgotten cases deserve attention, please subscribe to hear more stories of persistence, DNA breakthroughs, and families who never stopped fighting. Rate and share this episode, because somewhere, another family is still waiting for their own moment of resolution, and they need to know they're not alone.